Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. And we're very glad right now to welcome back to the program John Collins, who is Emeritus Professor of Global Studies at St. Lawrence University and Editorial Director at Weave News. He's the author of the 2011 book, Global Palestine, which explores the globalization of Palestine and the Palestinization of the globe. John, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's good to be back.
So I wanted to actually start. Folks might recall a couple of weeks ago we did a round table with myself, Mickey Huff, Shaylee Voidal, and Andy Lee Roth talking about the new State of the Free Press 2026 book. And John Collins has a chapter in this book about news abuse. And for those unfamiliar, news abuse refers to genuinely newsworthy stories that the establishment press covers in ways that obscure or distort the story's most important points. And you use the brief nomination period of Congress member Elise Stefanik as the U.S. ambassador to the UN as a lens through which to view news abuse vis-a-vis anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. As you write, the coverage of this nomination, quote, revealed establishment media's failure to interrogate how spurious accusations of anti-Semitism serve not only to drive U.S. support for Israel's settler colonial project, but also to fuel a MAGA movement that is deeply anti-Semitic, end quote. Irony is dead. And as noted at the top of this week's program, a recent report by the American Association of University Professors shows that all but one of 102 anti-Semitism complaint letters analyzed focus on speech critical of Israel. Of those, 79% contain allegations of anti-Semitism that simply describe criticisms of Israel or Zionism with no reference to Jews or Judaism. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the specific instance of news abuse that you use for this lens, and indeed the kind of opaque framing as a form of news abuse in the sense that Stefanik's Bible-thumping Looney Tune ideas about Israel's right to control the Holy Land were never questioned or put into context. About not just how crazy that is, but speaking as a Jew, how not accurate that is according to the Torah. So, John, could you talk a little bit about that chapter that you wrote?
Yeah, I mean, my motivation for writing it came out of the fact that I was living in northern New York at the time, and that's, Elise Stefanik is, the congressional representative for that part of New York State, and so she's a known character. She's been covered heavily by various news outlets up in northern New York, obviously throughout the whole state of New York, and she's pretty well known as a political opportunist. I mean, I think even some of her supporters would admit that, she's a bit of a shapeshifter, and that she sort of moved increasingly toward Trump, toward MAGA, as a way to continue kind of, launching herself up the ladder. And as part of that, she was doing a lot of grandstanding in Congress around the time of the student encampments on U.S. college campuses, the anti-genocide protests. And she, I think, very cynically just used that as a way to get herself in the news and to show her fealty to Trump. And then she got the UN ambassador nomination, which was a pretty big story up in northern New York, obviously, because she's a major figure in the news. And so I kind of zeroed in on the coverage that was provided of that story by North Country Public Radio, which is a news outlet that I've followed for years, and they've covered Stefanik for years, often quite critically in terms of investigating some aspects of her career, her connections with certain kinds of far-right politics and so forth. So I was really surprised when their coverage of her confirmation hearing really let her off the hook in a number of ways, right? There were plenty of opportunities there to, let's say, call into question or interrogate some of the contradictions in her testimony having to do with, claims that she made, as you said, about Israel's supposed biblical right to control territory, some of her claims about the UN and UNRWA, the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees, and then a really almost surreal moment in the testimony when she was questioned by a member of the committee about the Elon Musk salute that he had made, I think, just a day prior or 2 days prior. So it was very fresh in the news, and asked her about that. And she sort of pivoted or deflected that by saying, but I fought against anti-Semitism. How can you say that I'm, close to people who may be Nazis, right? And so there was all sorts of problems with what she was saying that were obvious to anybody who pays attention to the politics surrounding Israel and Palestine and anti-Zionism. And North Country Public Radio just sort of presented those as, well, this is what she said. There wasn't really much pushback from the committee, so nothing else to see here, right? And I thought that was a tremendous missed opportunity to help the audience understand what Stefanik was up to, and also the broader implications of that, because it was not that long after that that we had the Mahmoud Khalil case. We had, the increasing crackdown on different kinds of political speech, especially anti-genocide speech in the U.S. And I think many establishment media were sort of caught a little bit flat-footed there, thanks to their own long-term failures in terms of how they've covered these issues for decades.
Yeah, and I want to get into the how they've covered it for decades, but I think an interesting point that comes through in what you write is that when the press is afraid or not even not afraid, they just don't want to for a variety of reasons, when they don't actually contextualize things, when they don't push back, then it kind of normalizes this idea that you shouldn't, right? So if we see that 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 the media is conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism and they're afraid to call out this dangerous conflation, then it kind of has this trickle-down effect to where people are like, well, then I shouldn't do that, right? And it's this don't trust your own eyes and don't trust your what you're actually seeing, because the media is therefore really powerful. And what I found interesting too is that you chose an outlet that is not, it's not Fox News, it's not NBC, it's not the New York Times. This is a local station. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of it, because I think a lot of times people think, well, if it's local media, they have the power, they have the space to kind of push back against the establishment, right? But that's obviously not the case here.
It wasn't the case here, and I found that surprising in part because, I mean, NCPR, which is it's local, it's also regional. I mean, it's a station that serves a pretty broad geographical area throughout northern New York, Vermont, Ontario, parts of Quebec. Um, and they've done some really excellent coverage of Stefanik, right? I mean, they've shown that they're able to do that kind of investigation. They've also they did a podcast, for example, about um, sort of the rise of the far right in the North Country of northern New York, and the kind of infiltration of certain, of local law enforcement, those kinds of things, right? So that, these are good, folks who do a lot of good journalism, right? And so the failure to hold Stefanik to account, or even just to present her words in a broader context, I found troubling, but also just emblematic of a much larger pattern, right? Because when it comes to coverage of, issues related to Israel and Israeli domination of Palestinians, there's not much incentive for your average, local newspaper, local station, or really any outlet to step outside the ideological consensus there. I mean, this has been documented for decades. And so it's not surprising that they didn't push back on what Stefanik was saying. It's just really unfortunate because, as you say, it then gives license to or permission to the audience to not ask questions themselves. It continues to naturalize patterns, that establishment media have been naturalizing for years, all of which lends, direct support to ethnic cleansing, colonization, genocide, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this also proves that there's really no outlet that's a monolith, that's always good or always bad, right? I oftentimes say, like, yeah, there have been good articles written in the New York Times. You know, it's like Medea Benjamin, for instance, has written op-eds for the New York Times, and things like that, and not just people who are organizers on that level, but it really shows the importance of critical media literacy everywhere. Like, you can't just switch it off when you walk into or you engage with an outlet that you're like, oh, these people agree with me on things, so I don't have to think. You really have to you have to use that critical media literacy in all spaces and all outlets, because nobody's perfect, quote unquote, all the time. And there are going to be missteps, either purposeful or because people don't know any better. And again, with I think another thing that you point out is the framing. And we have on projectcensored.org, we have a framing guide that really talks about the fact that there's no such thing as objective journalism, because there's no such thing as objective life, right? We're all shaped by our experiences and our perspectives, and that shows up in media. And the best that we can hope for is that media is honest about how, what they're presenting, and honest about their bias. But, just the idea, like, when I was reading your chapter, I was like, the fact that we're even talking about biblical rights versus international law, like, what laws are we supposed to follow? Because, if it's biblical law, my father has a right to sell me. I can be stoned to death for having sex outside of marriage, which means I would be up to my like umpteenth stoning at this point. I mean, it's like, but I mean, we're not following international law. I mean, we're not following biblical law, but the framing of that is just so dangerous, because it suggests that you can just pick and choose, and you can pick something that is like a theologically violent perspective that, as you pointed out, promotes genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I mean, that is really scary to just kind of passively, accept that and thereby normalize it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, as particularly with regards to how the media covers Palestine, how this kind of biblical framing that overrides the international law framing is really horrifically present and omnipresent, I would say, in that coverage.
Well, it's definitely present, and it's been present for a long time. It doesn't always dominate the coverage. It's not that common these days to hear any, reporter or news organization say something like, Israel claims or Israeli leaders claim that they have a biblical right. You know, what they'll say more often is that Israel claims it's responding to, Palestinian terrorism. Israel claims that it has a right to defend itself. Those kinds of things are repeated ad nauseum. The biblical thing, it pops in every once in a while. And again, I mean, it is horrifying because it's like, if on the one hand, if we assume that we're going to allow claims of biblical rights to enter into public discussions of geopolitical issues, then, okay, well, there may be a lot of other folks who may have other random claims they want to throw in there too, right? But of course, the issue here is that it's actually an exception, right? It's an exception that's made for Israel because no reporter in their right mind would entertain a claim by any other country that there is a biblical right to conquer territory, to displace a population, to destroy their homes, to destroy their crops, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was just bizarre, right? Because here you have Stefanik in this hearing, and she's asked by a member of the committee, you said previously in an earlier conversation that that you agree with, that you support the claim that's been made by some of these Israeli leaders that they have this biblical right. Is that still your view? And she said, yes. And okay. So if I'm the reporter in that case, I mean, the first thing that's going to set off some alarm bells. That's an odd thing for a potential ambassador to the UN to say. Okay, so I looked at the Times and I looked at a number of establishment outlets, and they all sort of acknowledged or just briefly mentioned that aspect of what had happened in the hearing. But nobody led with that. I mean, that's to me, that's the obvious lead. Here we have an ambassador, potential ambassador to the UN, who is saying that biblical rights are a thing. Okay, like, um, you had to go to the independent media, the independent press, to find that aspect of the story put at the center, right? And thinking about and foregrounding the implications of that. Okay, so there's on the one hand we have to think about the broader implications. On the other hand, we have to think about the exceptional nature of what's allowed in the case of Israel, and that, of course, has been also part of the coverage for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I mean it's just so it's I mean I'd laugh, but like my friend says, there's so much to cry about, you gotta laugh. But it's so fascinating too because then this connects to the idea that somebody's and I mean, I think myself as an agnostic, but I would never expect anybody to build a society with laws that are based on, beliefs like in a book. It should be based on empirical evidence and on, things that you can actually tactily feel and notice, like humanity. But like it also connects then to this idea that, oh, okay, well, we should ensure that people can bar LGBTQ folks from even existing, out loud because it makes their belief centers uncomfortable, right? It's against their religion to have these kind of people. And so it uplifts it. And again, it normalizes this idea that, yeah, if it says that in the Bible, then we should act that out in society, and that should take precedent again over things that you can empirically notice, like oppression and human rights and ecocide and genocide. Like that this mythological ideology should then take precedent, and that's a very dangerous precedent to make. And it also, I feel, ties into something that I mentioned when I introduced you and that you've obviously written quite a bit about, not least of all a book. But the Palestinization of the globe. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, how this seeps into and affects policy and society far outside the confines of occupied Palestine. Because I think some people might be familiar with the term like Balkanization, for instance, but you bring up Palestinization, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to talk about, and I want to be clear about what I mean by it and what I don't mean by it. Okay, so I think there's a temptation maybe for people to think, oh, well, you're saying that we're all Palestinians now, that kind of thing, which is a slogan maybe that we found in some cases in solidarity movements with Palestine, right? And that can be. More than misleading, it can be kind of offensive if you're a Palestinian saying, "Oh, okay, well, wait a minute, what we're experiencing is should be the focus here, right? Let's not assume that everybody is becoming Palestinian." So it's not about that. It's not about claiming an identity, right? It's about a structural argument. Okay, a structural argument having to do with the nature of the systems of colonial domination that have been imposed upon Palestinians by the state of Israel and the Zionist movement, right? And understanding the nature of those structures, how they played out, right? And then thinking about the way that those structures are embedded in global systems, right? Having to do with the capitalist system, forms of neoliberal capitalism in particular, militarism, and the way that technologies of violence circulate around the world. Okay, now, in the last 10 years, we've developed a much more sophisticated, much more detailed understanding of how the technologies of violence that have been pioneered by the Israeli state um, are circulating globally, right? There was, of course, the moment with the Ferguson uprising, right, where we discovered that, or many people discovered for the first time this like what's called the deadly exchange between police in the U.S. and in Israel, right? And that's just one example. So the Palestinization idea is in part this idea that Palestine has been for a long time and continues to be a kind of testing ground for different, not only different weapons, but different forms of control, right? Including things like now the use of AI to support, sort of military operations, different forms of uh, domination through control of data, right? All sorts of things that have been pioneered there that then are transported elsewhere through things like weapon sales or bilateral relationships between Israel and other states, right? So that more and more people around the world, once they become aware of these things, come to see that there are certain aspects of their experience or our experience, right, that are not just similar to what some of what Palestinians have experienced, but is structurally connected to what Palestinians have experienced. Okay, so ultimately, for me, the idea of the Palestinization of the globe is really, like I said, a kind of structural argument to understand what globalization has actually meant and how it then produces certain kinds of common experiences across borders through the kinds of global processes that I discuss in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you said, they're very what's the word? Like very provable connections, not just in terms of, the IDF training with law enforcement here, but for instance, just recently, I read that there's a company called Skydio, which does drones. They make drones, like they're the biggest drone manufacturer in the U.S. And they've sent, 100 plus drones to Israel so that Israel can better surveil and oppress Palestinians. And Skydio also has contracts with some 800 law enforcement and surveillance agencies in the United States. And so this is not just like, it's not just ideological, which of course it is, settler colonialists flock together, but it's a very, tech driven and actually like with actual weapons and actual devices that connect these struggles. And I think that that's a very important thing to note. And I wanted to end here with kind of circling back to the chapter and highlighting, some perhaps some prescriptions, not just in terms of, because you do Weave News, which does a powerful job of not just covering news, but covering news from like kind of a grassroots perspective, which is incredibly lacking in corporate media on purpose. Um, but in terms of the coverage of what's happening on the ground in Gaza, and I would say also the coverage of potential politicians or ambassadors or what have you, is typically very anemic in the corporate media. Like when Hillary Clinton was running for office, nobody brought out her dirty laundry in the corporate media. It was just like, oh my God, a woman president. Oh, who could imagine? And all the countries with female presidents, like, we could. Um, so I'm wondering if kind of wrapping up here, you could talk about some prescriptions, not just for media in terms of how to really do a proper job of finding these chinks in the armor of someone like Stefanik, or of like the perspectives that are presented about Stefanik, but also for readers or listeners, how to set those alarm bells ringing when something passes like that and nobody pushes back against it.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important work, obviously, to continue pushing on this front. Okay, so a first prescription I think would be reporters need to stop outsourcing to elected officials the job of asking critical questions. Because what happens in hearings like this is the default reporting thing is, well, the Democrats said this and the Republicans said this. And if it's a Republican nominee, well, okay, the Democrats asked some critical questions and I'm reporting the critical questions that they asked. Therefore, I've done my job, right? And I think in other contexts, and it's odd because these are in many cases reporters who, if they were reporting a different kind of story, would do more critical investigative work themselves. But when it comes to something like a public hearing, they just sort of fall back on, I mean, we can call it lazy or path of least resistance or whatever. This idea of, well, just let the senators, let the members of Congress have their debate and report that debate. Okay, that's not good enough, right? So the prescription would be, you have to do your job as a reporter and do that deeper investigation. The other thing I would emphasize here is, and just the example from Stefanik's hearing of how poorly establishment media um, present this issue of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, right? They fail to make the obvious and clear and important distinctions, and the repeated failure to do that has direct material consequences, obviously for Palestinians, right? But I think even beyond that, because the failure to connect the dots and to understand what Stefanik was doing in terms of running interference for Netanyahu, essentially, right, made it harder then to recognize how the experiences of Palestinians are the thin end of the wedge, right? Going after protesters who were acting in solidarity with Palestinians. That's the thin end of the wedge that opens the door for a much wider form of authoritarian repression. Okay. And if news organizations like the New York Times, for example, suddenly discovered recently this thing called Canary Mission, which many folks have known about for more than a decade, and they reported it as a shadowy organization. Well, it's been in the shadows for them, right? Because they weren't paying attention to it or they ignored it. So if you do a better job of honestly reporting what anti-Zionism is, it's not anti-Semitism, right? And making that clear to audiences, then it's going to become, I think, um, easier for the reporters themselves and for audiences to understand other things that are also happening in terms of the fascist tide that we're seeing, the forms of authoritarian governance that we're seeing, right? Palestine often points us toward those understandings if we're willing to listen and make those connections.
Yeah, and I think in a previous interview, you said something that just echoes in my mind periodically, that Palestine is a lens through which we can see almost any topic, whether that be the obvious like settler colonialism and apartheid and genocide, but also things, like racism and labor issues, and I mean all kinds of things that Palestine is a critical lens for, again, if and when it's used as such. So,
Right.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us again. Folks, do check out, again, his book from 2011 called, because nothing started on October 7th, called Global Palestine. And of course, the amazing reporting that happens over at Weave News. John, thanks again so much.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's great to be with you as always. Take care.